So, I don't know if this is overly working, but I'll just position this there. So, we're clearly entering the most turbulent period in human history, and this is said quite a lot, but as Marxists, we don't just, come out with these phrases. It's based on analysis of the economic, political, and social phenomena that lie around the world at this period of time. And if you just take a brief look at the bourgeois press, it seems to be a chorus of people from economics, professors, politicians, and all forms of academics that are bemoaning the current state of affairs. I mean, if you look at the FT just last week, there were several articles just stating that, bemoaning that Britain is in a state of decay, there is no, basically, solution to the crisis, and very notable figures have came out, including David Cameron just earlier this year, or at the tail end of last year, that summed this up, saying that the world economy has red lights are flashing all over. Basically, what we can tell from this is that the world economy is in a poor state of affairs. There's a common thread that really unites all these people together. These people can't see a solution to the crisis which doesn't exacerbate another point of the world economy. This is really kind of summed up with an article put last year by noted economist Nouriel Roubini that has a very nice tag of Dr. Doom, because he basically foretold the 2008 financial crisis. He basically came out with this article talking about the world economy is like an aeroplane with 4 engines, and in normal economic times it needs all 4 engines to be fully operational to basically guide through turbulent weather. And he basically analyses the world economy and says, well, if we actually look at the real state of affairs, we can see that basically 3 of the engines are spluttering or completely non-operational, and there's one that is basically driving the world economy at this moment in time. But he basically notes in this that, well, you can't have just one engine working. Basically, it puts additional strain on this. And over a period of time, with this additional strain, they'll also splutter out. And he's basically talking about the effects of the Eurozone, the slowdown in China, upon the US economy, and how basically the strengthening of the dollar will basically pacify economic growth in this period as well. There's also reports by the OECD at the tail end of last year as well, basically foretelling that we've got 50 years ahead of us of basically secular stagnation. This is a very little growth, of basically between 1% and 2% growth for the next 50 years. This is basically the prognosis of the capitalists, what they can tell about this situation. There's articles by noted Cambridge academic Hayu Zhang, I'll probably bastardize that, but basically saying that this is no real, basically saying, well, even if we look at the so-called engine that is still working, basically this is no recovery, it's just a re-inflation of the bubble. All the policies that have been taken since 2008 are just basically trying to pump up the bubble even greater. And this is just no, basically, solution to the crisis. So why are we at this state of affairs at this moment in time? Well, it clearly derives from the crisis in capitalism in the financial sector that sparked since 2008, where we saw very quickly a financial crisis rooted very deeply into the financial systems based on years and years of speculation, of a myriad of an alphabetical soup of names, of derivatives and such, basically pumping loads of credit into the economy to basically stop a crisis from happening, basically imploded. And we saw this crisis in the financial sector basically thrown straight into sovereign debt crisis that particularly affected the Eurozone. And this is what I'm going to concentrate very briefly on now. But at this stage, before the financial crisis really took hold in a sovereign debt crisis, what we heard from politicians of Europe was, well, we're kind of safe from this. This is just the Americans and the Anglo-Saxons, the basically blue eyes, basically, they basically messed up the world economy. We've been fairly frugal, we're fine, But what we saw was very quickly this kind of myth of decoupling of the world economy, that you can have one part basically sidestep an economic crisis, completely shatter in front of their eyes, and we saw it rip across the whole of Europe, and we're still feeling these effects 7-8 years later on. Basically what we saw is a unification of all bourgeois economists basically come out and basically agree, from Greenspan, monetarist, Keynesians, basically, well, we have to solve this, we need to bail out the banks. We saw the people that were basically talking about free market economies, about, the state should not interfere. As soon as there's a huge economic crisis, these men of very noble principles basically ditched them all to make sure that the economic to basically save the banking system. And in these crises, there is always the question of who pays. And we saw very quickly that basically, well, we can tell who pays. It's always the working class and the young and the youth. And what we saw was vicious public sector cuts, basically financial crisis and economic crisis led on to falling tax revenues and wage stagnation and a huge explosion of world debt. What we saw was prior to the financial crisis, was a huge pumping of credit into the world economy to a state of around about 180% of global GDP if we exclude financial derivatives. And basically the program after the crisis, quantitative easing, etc., has led to an even further expansion of this debt horse. And what we can see is over the last, this is the last 15 years, an explosion of debt from 180% to roughly 250% of global GDP. And this is excluding basically financial houses and the banks. Basically, we can see, if we look at Britain particularly, we see that currently UK debt, including financial debt, including housing debt, etc., is at this moment in time 500% of GDP. This is a completely unsustainable situation. There's a direct consequence of the policies that were pursued after the crisis in a way because there's no other solution to it. Basically, we had a problem with finance, etc., and the only way that they can see out of the crisis is just to basically keep on, doing the same program again. It's kind of like I want to use that analogy. It's not very nice. But another situation isn't just financial derivatives and all these myriad of things that have added to this burden of debt, but we can see in the last 5 years housing debt within the UK, as this household debt, people, what we have basically taken on as students, as well as credit cards, etc., has increased by 15% since the financial crisis. What we can see is basically UK household debt has jumped from 60% of GDP, our annual turnout, to 75% at this moment in time. This is because of falling wages, as well as people needing to sustain themselves, basically taking out more credit to basically bridge this gap as kind of a way to bridge it. So, thank you. What we can really tell from this is that basically the world economy is on very uneven kilter. Basically, all these statistics about debt was basically put forward by a BBC article at the end of last year. And basically the conclusion at the end, I think, summarised all the conclusions from every piece that I've read recently. And it can basically be summarised as this: well, what is the solution? And it said very plainly, well, we don't know. Nobody knows. All that we know is things are bad. And that is the basically analysis from bourgeois economists, that there is no way out of this current crisis that they can see, because either you pump up, provide more credit, i.e. more debt that at a certain point has to be paid back. You can see this as a way out of the for a sovereign debt crisis. If you borrow more, the financial markets turn on you. You have to pay more in the interest. So therefore, you can't, spend your way out of this. But the opposite is to this, a tax upon people's wages and living conditions, and that has an associated effect on the economy, but also a political consequences that we're seeing all around Europe at this moment in time. Basically, and this is a situation we really find ourselves in, is these attacks upon the working class has basically brought about a polarisation in the situation, and we've seen phenomenon of Syriza and Podemos, and before that the Nardos movement that I'm sure comrades will come in, the international comrades, and fill in these details. But there is something that's common to everything that's basically happening around the world at this moment in time. It seems that a very small sparks basically alighting mass movements and very quickly turning into big struggles. I mean, over the last several years, we saw in Turkey, Gezi Park, basically demolishing of the public space to build a shopping mall, basically turning to a struggle that is basically uniting the discontent. In Brazil, we saw the World Cup and FIFA and the rising of bus fares that similarly sparked something there. The IPN students and the 43 students that were disappeared in Mexico, the Arab Spring. What did we see there was the fact is one man in Tunisia who was made to move on so he can sell his wares and basically burn himself alive, and that sparked mass protests. As Marxists, we can see these small sparks, and we can clearly say that these sparks are happening on a daily basis throughout the whole of the world. It's not that, but there's something that these ones kind of unite and basically light a flame, but to light something, there needs to be something that's around to light, and that is the economic situation that's basically provided the tinder and united discontent across the whole of the class. And we see that it's not necessarily, these small sparks, but big campaigns as well. With the independence campaign in Scotland also united people to fight for something different. You see that the role of the traditional organisations, basically, the trade unions and stuff are basically playing not at the forefront of these struggles to begin with. There seems to be, spontaneous and kind of student youth-led movements to begin with that rapidly develop a mass character. And this brings in fresh layers into the struggle. What we also see is that, the effect of unemployment across the whole of Europe at this moment in time is skyrocketing, and this is bringing together, providing this tinder. We've seen youth unemployment across Europe since the crisis absolutely explode. It is completely untenable. But if we actually look just before the economic crisis, it wasn't a rosy state of affairs for youth either. We can see that this is the economic trends of youth unemployment in the last period, and this is when the economic crisis hit. We see a huge explosion across the whole of Europe, but prior to that, it was bubbling along at around about 18%. It's not like capitalism normally provides full employment under normal affairs. And capitalism is completely incarnate and is a completely chaotic system that cannot provide for people when it's supposedly doing well for itself. So that poses a question for Marxists. Well, what do we need to do? We have these, we're living in a period of sharp turns and sudden events where small sparks very quickly can turn into mass movements affairs. And capitalism is completely incarnate and is a completely chaotic system that cannot provide for people when it's supposedly doing well for itself. So it poses a question for Marxists. Well, what do we need to do? We have these, we're living in a period of sharp turns and sudden events where small sparks very quickly can turn into mass movements. And so why do we have this conference today? It's to basically build a leadership, people that can actually take part in these movements and actually provide the solution to the crisis, and actually something that no other person can do. And that is actually to point out the real barriers to growth at this moment in time, but uniting it with the actual struggles that are taking place. We have to say that the main barrier to growth at this moment in time and to actually harmonious way development is two things, and that is the nation state and private property. We should never forget to kind of bring these avenues forward and unite the struggles around the world. And I believe that's what we'll begin to do at this conference today.